So if you fast forward another 50, 75 years, you get to 1846. What do we have in 1846? Well, that's the year that ether anesthesia is invented. So if you start at the beginning of 1846, no anesthesia, no modern microscopy, the microscopes are still too primitive, no modern chemistry, organic chemistry had not been invented yet. So there were no dyes, there was no germ theory, no one believed in germs. Everyone just believed in bad air. Does anyone know how to say bad air in Italian? Malaria. Malaria is bad air. Because you can't figure out if everyone around you is getting malaria, there's nothing in your mind that could convince you that that's coming from a mosquito bite, right? You couldn't, like, what? There's no way a mosquito is giving all of us malaria. It's the bad air, malaria. And certainly no antibiotics. Enter Robert Koch. He was Prussian in what's now present-day Poland, in what was then Wolstein, now it's Wolsztyn, Poland. And it was this guy that proved more than any other person on the back of Pasteur, who had thought about fermentation, but it's Robert Koch who proved that bacteria were real. And he did it in this house. So present-day Wolsztyn, this is the front door. I was there a couple years ago. And if you look through this door, this is where one night on Christmas Eve, 1875, that a police officer brought to Koch a dead sheep. So you can imagine Wolstein is a wool-producing valley, and from time to time, they would have anthrax plagues. No one knew why. You'd go years, and then all of a sudden, sheep were dying like crazy, and it would destroy the economy. A police officer brought in his sheep right into this area, that bay window I asked you to look at here. So there's the front door. I'm gonna walk looking down the street. This is Poland now. If you walk to this back street, this back area, this is where he saw patients and had his little microscope. They broke the bank. He could not afford the good new microscope that Joseph Jackson Lister had just invented. If you look down in this room, down the middle of this room, there's this board right there. That's where there was a drape. His microscope was back there. He saw patients in the front. This guy was an inveterate researcher. I can just see him seeing a patient. He ended up, that window right here on the left is right here. He looked at that dead sheep and thought, you know what? I'm gonna look at its blood. Now that I have this new microscope, I'm gonna see if I can see anything. And he looked and he saw these little circles, much smaller than a human cell, but these little dots look like little pepper flakes. And he thought, I wonder if that is what is killing these sheep and men and women. And he looked out that window, and out in the window was his daughter's pet rabbit in a cage. He thought, here's my experiment. I'm gonna go grab that rabbit, and I'm gonna look at its blood. I'm gonna see if I can see those little flakes. My microscope is so good, I can't believe it. Thank God my wife let me use all our money for this microscope. He looked at the rabbit's blood, nothing there. Perfect. So he took the blood from the sheep, he purposely injected the rabbit, put it back in its cage on Christmas Eve. The next day is Christmas Eve. He's doing clinic in that room. He's looking out the window. I wonder if the rabbit's gonna get sick. Is it gonna die? My daughter's pet rabbit. By that night, the rabbit had died. Aww. He then went and looked at the rabbit's blood, and he saw the same little growth there. And he looked out the window and he saw his daughter's pet guinea pig. And he did it again, and he made it sick, and he made it die, and he saw the same thing. So in medical school, we learned about Koch's postulates. I've just told you Koch's postulates. Find a disease, identify an organism, introduce the same organism to another animal, create the same disease, and see the same organism. To this day, that's Koch's postulates. That's the house where it happened. And in so doing, he identified anthrax. Turns out, lucky for us, lucky for him, the anthrax bacteria is one of the biggest in the whole world. So he could actually see it, even with his fairly limited microscope. He figured out in short order cholera, diphtheria, rabies. He just went down the line and identified all the organisms. And In a rush, in the space of about 20 years, staph, strep, all bacteria were organized, and everyone in the world all of a sudden believed that germs were real because of Koch and Pasteur and Lister. Now we have a fighting chance to do surgery. Because if you don't believe in germs, you can't do anything because you don't believe in washing your hands. And that's what Lister figured out. If germs are real, we have to wash our hands. So the cellular basis of disease, because the microscope was good enough, because of Joseph Lister's father, Joseph Jackson Lister, had a good enough microscope where you can actually see tissues. Rokitansky on the left, he's from Vienna. He's the guy that did 30,000 autopsies in his lifetime. Never used a microscope once. But he was there at the beginning of the revolution when Vienna became the world capital of medicine. Vienna was the place. And if you, this day, go to the University of Vienna undergrad campus, that's where their general hospital was. You can stand in one square of the Vienna University and say, that's where dermatology was invented, that's where ophthalmology was invented, that's where general surgery was invented. In one place. You can look at it where all these guys were just challenging each other, again, like a genius society in that one place. That's where local anesthetics were invented. Cocaine, lidocaine, xylocaine, right there. Cocaine was the first. In our minds, we don't associate cocaine, lidocaine, xylocaine, but they're all the canes. Cocaine was the first, and it was invented right there with Rokitansky. Virchow ran with it. He said, Carl, you're a really smart guy, but in Berlin, he was in Berlin, he said, what we're going to do is we're going to take it up a notch. We're going to do thousands, tens of thousands of autopsies, but we're going to use our microscope. And it was Rudolf Virchow who looked at this young guy with this creamy blood who had died, 26-year-old guy, and he looked at a microscope, and in German he said, it looks like white Blut. In Latin, we would say leukemia, white blood. He figured out leukemia, he figured out cancer. He's the guy, Virchow on the right, is the one who figured out every cell in the human body comes from another cell. That's the guy. So the cellular basis of disease was followed. Remember I told you about Morgagne's book called De Sedibus? Rokitansky built this incredible research building. This is the organization to understand the seats and causes of disease. He didn't just write a book, he built a building to understanding the seats and causes of disease. To this day, even though it's every other building on University of Vienna is now just an undergraduate campus, this is still the brain research building. So those two guys, again, Koch and Virchow, accomplished everything because of Joseph Lister's father. That's Joseph Jackson Lister. Just a wealthy wine merchant with a weird hobby of microscopy, invented the microscope that finally cut down on chromatic aberration. Here on the back of Rokitansky's building, here's this auditorium. Here's what it looks like today. And if you look at this building, it's completely unchanged when our hero, Theodor Billroth, came along. Do you see? This is a very famous painting by Seligman that's in the Belvedere Museum in Austria. There it is today, and here's the famous painting. And in the middle, there's Billroth. He's the first abdominal surgeon in the world. He's the guy. Because if you think about it, every anatomical surgical atlas, all the way up into the mid-1800s, only showed arm surgery, eyeball surgery, finger surgery, maybe thigh surgery. There's not a single drawing of the abdomen or thorax. They didn't dare go there. There be dragons. You can't do it. And Billroth said, watch me. Even though there's no such thing as antibiotics. He did esophageal surgery, larynx surgery. He did rectal surgery 75 years before there were antibiotics. And the patients lived. This guy's a miracle worker because he used Lister's techniques of washing his hands. Shocking. So here's, in that square, here's the square where you can stand and look where ophthalmology, dermatology, general surgery was born. I love this statue for two reasons. Number one, he's the first guy to wear a surgical gown. It happened to be white. He's the first guy, Billroth, was the first guy to wear a surgical gown. Even our hero, Lister, he operated like dressed like I'm dressed. Wouldn't even roll up his wool suit. Whereas Bill Roth had white, and he's washing his hands. He changed the world, Bill Roth did. This is where surgery all of a sudden is gaining prominence, and visionaries like this were inventing surgery right before our eyes. Now, they were still only taking stuff out. Bill Roth died having never put anything in. They would do surgery and use silk to close up the wounds and leave the tails long and not close the skin, knowing that the sutures would dissolve and hopefully you wouldn't die before you healed. So at the end of Bill Roth's career, by 1893, now you have modern chemistry. Thank God you have anesthesia. Everyone believes in germs, infections, and cancer. We're starting to understand how it works. And shockingly, elective surgery is happening. So if you've got a hernia, you can actually think about doing hernia surgery. You're not about to die, you would choose to have surgery. This is a shocking thought in 1893. But still, metals were super primitive, no such thing as antibiotics. I'd be amazed if anyone in this room knew that the first clinical dose of penicillin was given in 1941 and not before. Who thinks that's shocking? The first dose of, 1941. So even in 1930s, there's plenty of people here whose parents were alive in the 1930s. No chance of antibiotics. It didn't exist. So across from the famous Louvre Museum is the Musée d'Orsay on the Seine. And in there is one of my favorite paintings. I looked at this before. Here's Payon. So what do you guys think? So it's in the 1880s. See, he's getting ready to operate. See his jacket? See all his assistants? Yes, we have anesthesia. Do you see the ether sponge? And this clamp, you're doing anesthesia by just bringing the sponge closer and closer to the mouth and hopefully not getting high yourself. He's getting ready to do breast surgery. And everyone's standing around, no masks, no gloves, no cap, but he was washing his hands. And in his hands, he has his famous hemostat, the Payon. I use it every day in the operating room. My ortho buddies in the room, when you use that little hemostat, that's a Payon. And I'd looked at this painting before, and as part of one of my research trips around Paris, had gone up to the Saint Louis Hospital. Here it is, and it's mostly derelict and empty. And I went in there, the guy turned on the lights, and his English was bad as my French is. And he started turning on all the lights. And I took a few minutes for everything to flicker to life. This famous wax museum was built so surgeons could look and think about disease, one model at a time. And then I walked away and I glanced into this kind of really messy library, and I glanced at the statue in the corner. Does that look familiar? Here he is, there's Payon. And you could say, especially in Oklahoma, which I'm going to make a really strong point here in a second, why would I care about Payon? Well, Payon was the guy that did the world's first joint replacement. And this implant itself is in the Smithsonian Museum, which is a fun story how it got here. But Payon was the guy. It's made of platinum and rubber. He did it on a 34-year-old patient that had a tuberculosis infection. And there's the model itself. And if you look at it, I love it, because I've always known what this is, but here it is from the collection Payon. I think this may be the proximal humerus he took out to do that shoulder. So American hospitals, in 1 year, something miraculous happened. In 1889, the Mayo Hospital, the St. Mary's Hospital was built. Also, the Johns Hopkins Hospital was built in that same year. And the old hospital for ruptured and crippled. They don't call it the Hospital for Ruptured and Crippled anymore. They call it, does anyone know? The Hospital for Special Surgery. It's the oldest orthopedic hospital in the Western Hemisphere, with less rooms in it than the McBride Hospital here in town. But why were these massive hospitals built all in the same year? Why weren't they built before? Well, electricity, the very first electrified neighborhood was in 1882 in New York, which then was closely followed by the first commercial elevator. You can't have a big hospital if you don't have an elevator. So again, it's one of these things that everything's working together, the Industrial Revolution bringing about different things. And one of the big things it brings is electricity to a hospital. It's dangerous to have gas lighting in a hospital if you have oxygen going. But now if you have electricity, you can have an elevator. We're getting more modern. That third industrial revolution is on the cusp.